My pleasure to introduce, as our first keynote speaker, Carl Zimmer. He's a columnist for the New York Times and the author of 13 books about science. In his latest book, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Powers, Perversions, and the Potential of Heredity, won the National Academy of Sciences Communication Award and was selected by the New York Times Book Review as Notable Book of the Year. He is a professor adjunct at Yale University, and today he'll be speaking on Braided History, Reporting on Human Origins. Please join me in welcoming Carl.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. That's great. So it's a pleasure to join you today. Obviously the Allen Frontiers group works a lot, supports a lot of research on biology, kind of as biology is today, as it is in our bodies right now. But of course, that biology has a history, has a very long history, it's been a real privilege of mine to be able to report on that history for the New York Times. It might seem like, if you're at a newspaper and you're writing about things that happened like 50,000 years ago, you wouldn't be very busy. But actually, it keeps me surprisingly busy and is quite challenging, but in a really satisfying way. Just to give you one example from April, this is an article I wrote about an entirely new species, a new species of Homo called Homo luzonensis. And it was found by Armand Salvador Mijares from the University of the Philippines. And he was working in a cave. Initially, he was looking for traces of farming in the Philippines. And then he thought, well, maybe I should dig a little deeper. And so he dug a little deeper, and he found lots of bones. He found lots of bones of at least 3 individuals, maybe about 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years ago, there were Homo sapiens, humans like us in Asia, but this was not human in the sense that it wasn't Homo sapiens. It was a lot like us, but it might have been only 3 feet tall, maybe less. And this was pretty remarkable to write about, especially given that, a couple years earlier, I had been writing about another strange species from another island in Southeast Asia. This is called Homo floresiensis, sometimes nicknamed the Hobbit, just because, again, it's so small. Then this one lived between 700 and 60,000 years ago. Not only are these small, but their brains are small too. They're roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. And over in Africa, in South Africa, there has been this recently described species called Homo naledi, maybe as recently as 236,000 years ago, which in the scheme of things isn't that long ago. And this is a reconstruction of it. So we have at least 3 small, strange species of human-like individuals that have all been found quite recently and existed at a time when our species existed. We actually need kind of a new way of talking and writing about these kinds of finds because we're really locked into some old-fashioned ways of thinking about human evolution. My predecessors at the New York Times a century ago were not immune from this way of thinking. So this is an article where it's basically about research in the 20s, and it wasn't clear exactly where human origins might have been, Africa or Asia. But you can just look at how they sort of set up, how they visualize human evolution. From ape to man, the chain as it appears to the evolutionists. And so you can see the sort of this gradation from lemur to monkey to chimpanzee to what was called ape man of Java, now we call Homo erectus, to Neanderthals, to Cro-Magnon man. So of course those fossils of humans from Europe being of course at the top of this chain. And so people would think in this very linear way about what it meant to be human, how we became human, that there was this march of progress, and that all we needed to do to understand it was just to fill in a link in that chain. And so once you got the link, then it was simple. Then you understood it. And people use this language. So this is an article from about a decade later, again from the Times, literally using the language, missing link, seen in fossil of an ape. So this was an Australopithecus species, which was the most remarkable example at the time of a species that had some ape-like characteristics and some human-like characteristics in one skeleton. So again, we're not past this way of thinking. I mean, you see it everywhere. And certainly this iconic image from Rudolf Zallinger from the 60s, I believe, it's with us everywhere. This is like an incredibly common image. And we see it in all sorts of forms. This is just one of many I could pick of. And this is really how people think about it. And you know, if you're working with an editor who has this sort of mindset, it can be very challenging to talk about different kinds of humans existing at the same time, because they're like, well, where does it fit in the march? And you have to explain, well, it's not a march. And even, I would argue that a lot of scientists themselves try to simplify human evolution into some sort of linear march, and once you cross a certain threshold, we're human. And so we say, like, well, what makes us uniquely human? Well, we must have gone in some sort of direction, and then we crossed a line, and then voila, human. And so, you know, you can see here, for example, this is not from a cartoon or from a newspaper. This is from a published paper, and it's showing human brain size increasing over time in this, you know, linear way. Of course, if you look at the time scale at the bottom, you realize that things are maybe not so simple. And I'll point out how they're actually a lot less simple than that. So what do we know? I mean, if you look at DNA, it's clear that the great apes are our closest relatives, and that instead of thinking of us sort of moving along in a chain, we need to think of apes and the ancestors of humans branching apart at different points in time. And so our ancestors branched from our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, maybe 6 or 7 million years ago. So what happened in that branch, after that branching, that last branching? Well, with the most important information, I would argue, some of the most important information comes from fossils. And, you know, what I was showing you in the early 1900s, there was this thing called Java Man, and there was this thing called Australopithecus afarensis, Neanderthals, and that was about it. So really about three kinds of fossils. This is kind of what we're talking about now. This is going over the past 7 million years or so. We've got a lot. And a lot of these were found after I started working as a science journalist. So it's kind of amazing to be able to write articles where people are literally like sticking new rectangles on this chart. So Bernard Wood, who does this, this is actually like one of his latest iterations. He keeps having to revise it because we keep finding these new things. Now, one of the clearest lessons of this is that everything below that blue line is from Africa. So it is pretty clear that our origins, our very deep origins, are in Africa. Even our not so deep origins are as well. The oldest thing that looks like closer to humans than to apes, the oldest hominin, appears to be something called Sahelanthropus. And scientists have found its skull, and this is a reconstruction of it. You might say, like, well, I'm not really clear how that's not a chimpanzee, but there are some pretty fundamental differences. So, for example, the angle at the base of the skull is more like ours than like a chimpanzee's, which suggests that it was holding its head more upright. Similarly, another hominin called Orrorin from around the same time. Scientists have only found some fragments, but some important ones, like the leg bones, and the angle of those femurs also suggests that it was upright. So there's these clues that being upright was a key kind of transition from the other apes. And then by the time we get to about 4 or 5 million years ago, there's a species called Ardipithecus. And scientists have found much more of that, and that clearly was able to walk upright. What's interesting is, it also seems to have been very adept at climbing in trees. So it was still kind of a hybrid of a, ground walker, tree climber, several million years after our ancestors split off from other apes, and still had a very small brain, chimpanzee-sized brain. Now, this sort of ancient history is incredibly fascinating, and not surprisingly, there are a lot more questions than answers because it's hard to find fossils from 3, 4, 5, 6 million years ago. But if we just focus in on the last million years, you might think like, well, okay, well that's all settled, right? I mean, we found everything we need to find. People have found everything that could be found, right? And the fact is, no. And the irony is that this chart, which I lifted from a paper that came out in 2016, is out of date because that species I told you about, Homo luzonensis, it's not there. It came to light afterwards. So here's if you zoom in on the past million years, this is a paper that came out just a month or two ago. This is one way of interpreting all the different hominins, the members, and these are actually all Homo, that existed in the last million years. And there are a lot of them. You see Homo luzonensis in the corner there. So just to orient you, we're these sort of pale blue bars. Then you got Homo naledi over here in the sort of light green. Homo floresiensis is this dark blue. Neanderthals. Neanderthals are the sort of light green. And then there are these other people called the Denisovans, who I'll talk about a little bit later. But this is just a sampling of lots of different kinds of humans, all sharing the planet at once not very long ago. And it's likely that we're going to keep finding new humans. Given just how these were all found quite recently, except for the Neanderthals, obviously, we're going to be finding more. And they pose immediate challenges to our kind of old-fashioned ideas about human evolution, about that sort of march of progress. Now, it is clear that our brains are much bigger than chimpanzees. They're much bigger than Sahelanthropus, that first hominin. But is that because natural selection kept working on the human brain in some sort of steady, relentless way and just made it bigger and bigger and bigger? And was the selective pressure the same for that whole period? Is it just a one-way street, as this would suggest? No. Actually, if you really look at the brain sizes, things get a lot more complicated. Their brains have a wide range, even within a single species. And let's see if I can point here. And then you have Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis over here, recent Homo species with brains that are just way, way too small. This should not be like this. And these are not deformities. These were healthy individuals that just had brains not like ours. And so some researchers have argued, we've got a couple choices. Either they evolved from very deep branches and they just never got big, or they descended from big-brained ancestors and got really small really fast. Is it like if you put someone on an island, put a population of people on an island, do their brains shrink? These individuals were still able to make stone tools. They were still able to hunt. It's not like they were in some sort of island institution or something. These were totally capable individuals who lived in these places for tens, hundreds of thousands of years. So what happened? We need to sort of rethink what the human brain is capable of to explain this. Neanderthals always have this, this reputation, as being stupid. Neanderthal itself is kind of an insult. But really, they compare quite well to our own ancestors from the same period of time. You have to bear in mind, Neanderthals coexisted with humans. They had brains that were as big or bigger than humans. These are, from the left is a Homo sapiens, then Neanderthals, and then a couple chimpanzee skulls on the other side. Neanderthals lived across a spectacular range in all sorts of different environments. It's not like they were just, if you picture them on some ice age glacier, that's not it. They lived out in Siberia, they lived in the Near East, they lived in Spain, they caught dolphins. They did all sorts of amazing things. And they even seem to have had some sort of sense of sort of self, maybe, or being part of a group. Because scientists are finding things like ornaments. So this is a shell that was actually painted with pigment. There was in a place where Neanderthals lived. They appear to have made necklaces out of eagle talons. So imagine a Neanderthal, all decked out with jewelry, maybe face painted with ochre. One of the most intriguing things that's been found in recent years is in a cave in France. There are these stalactites that have been broken off from the cave and then arranged in circles. And this is at a time when there are only Neanderthals in Europe, and this is deep underground. And obviously scientists are trying to figure out, was this some sort of sacred space that were Neanderthals worshiping here? What was going on? It's hard to know, but the fact remains that it was our so-called lowly Neanderthals who were making those things. Then we have Denisovans, and again, this is a kind of human that I didn't know about until very far into my science writing career because nobody knew about them. In a cave in Siberia, scientists were finding bones, pinky bones, teeth of something that looked like it might be human, might be Neanderthal. It was too hard to tell. But fortunately, it had DNA in it. And so a number of researchers, including David Reich, who's here, they analyzed these and found that it was distinct from the DNA from humans and from Neanderthals. In other words, it was a separate branch, which has been called Denisovans, named after the Denisova Cave. So that was exciting to write about, but it was always kind of weird that, for several years, the only place that anyone knew about Denisovans was from the Denisova Cave. And you sort of figure something that's been around for tens or hundreds of thousands of years probably isn't just living in one cave. And so it was really kind of mind-blowing to have a chance earlier this year to write about scientists finding Denisovans thousands of miles away in Tibet. So in this spectacular location, there is a cave right here, which has actually been visited on regular occasions. As you can see here, it's not an isolated place. People go here to pray. And in Tibet, a Tibetan monk was just sort of in the middle of prayer and happened to notice a jaw on the cave floor. And this went into a collection in a Chinese university and really kind of got neglected for a while. But now it turns out that this was also a Denisovan. A Denisovan 160,000 years ago, living at very high elevation in Tibet. And so again, we don't know a lot about these Denisovans, but they have to have been pretty amazing individuals to survive at that kind of altitude. So then we get to our species, and you might think like, okay, well, all right, this is where things get simple, right? Homo sapiens, you get Homo sapiens evolving, and then that's it. We're uniquely human. How complicated could the story get at this point? Well, there have been some amazing discoveries. This was in 2017, where scientists published what they argued was the oldest fossil of our species, about 300,000 years old in Morocco. And it is clearly a very important find, and it helps bolster this hypothesis that our species arose in Africa. And you can see that not just by looking at fossils, but by looking at our own DNA. So Africans have way more diversity in terms of their DNA than everybody outside of Africa. And the clearest explanation for that is that our species started in Africa maybe around 300,000 years ago, stayed in Africa. Living Africans have inherited a lot of the genetic diversity that built up over that time, and non-Africans all descend from a very small group of people who expanded out of Africa with much less genetic diversity. So these different lines of evidence fit together, and if you try to draw a family tree, as it were, this is the kind of tree that you see. And so all non-Africans are over here is this tiny little branch coming off of the East African branch. But what's interesting is that up here, things don't sort of converge down to some neat little small group of people. In fact, it's getting hard to say, like, well, okay, Africa's a big place. So where in Africa did things start? Some people would say, well, we found this one in Morocco, this fossil in Morocco, so they must be there. North Africa, that's where Homo sapiens started. But the genetic evidence is not pointing that way, clearly. And actually, some scientists have argued if you look at other fossils from around the same time in Africa that no one's quite known what to do with. This is like Florisbad, for example. This is a skull found in a place called Florisbad. No one's quite known what to call this for years. And so some scientists are actually arguing, like, actually, these are both distinct populations of humans that all fed into our species. And so if you want to like visualize the way they're thinking about it, this is how they used to think about the origin of our species, where you've got one little population producing living populations. There are scientists who are arguing we need to think very differently. We need to think about lots of populations that are linked to each other, interbreeding, genes are flowing between each other. Some hit dead ends, others survive through time, but if you were to say, like, well, what's the ancestor of this? You'd say, like, well, okay, well, I guess there's this and this, and it gets complicated. That's the point, that the thinking about evolution as a chain, as a line, and so on, just even as a tree, the tree metaphor really starts to strain at this point. Another way in which that tree metaphor really starts to strain is when we look at our own DNA and look at the DNA we have inherited from extinct groups of humans, like Neanderthals, like Denisovans. This is something that's been clear for, I guess it's been about 10 years now, that non-Africans have between, I forget what the numbers are now, between 1% and 3% roughly Neanderthal DNA. And there are people who have a lot of Denisovan DNA. So this is just adapted from a recent study where you can see that in different places you have different percentages. So the orange is Neanderthal DNA. It turns out that East Asians have the most Neanderthal DNA of living humans. People in New Guinea, Papuans, have a whole lot of Denisovan DNA. But in any case, there are just billions of people walking around with this genetic heritage from people that we would think of as being extinct, as being other kinds of humans. They're here. They're you. When I was working on my most recent book, I was really fascinated by how these kinds of discoveries affect how we think of ourselves. And so as part of my exploration, I got my genome sequenced, and then I went to some scientists, and I asked them to help me to sort of make sense of it. And so Joshua Akey at Princeton, I asked him, I don't want to just know like what my percentage of Neanderthal DNA is. I'd be curious to see what Neanderthal genes I got. And he's like, oh, okay. And then, a couple weeks later, he and his grad student sent me a list. That's the beginning of the list. I've got, I think, like 700 Neanderthal genes, which is pretty standard. And it's very exciting, but of course, like, if you start to say like, oh, QS0X1, very exciting, I have a Neanderthal version of that. What does that mean? Either they have no idea what it means to have the Neanderthal version, or they have no idea what that gene does, period. So this is I find this like a very exciting frontier, if you will, of what it means to us, to our health, to have Neanderthal genes, to have Denisovan genes, to have genes from other kinds of humans that we haven't even encountered yet. And what this speaks to, again, is that human evolution has been complicated, and so that it's not a chain, and it's not even really a tree. I mean, it's a tree, plus. You have these populations where there has been interbreeding between the branches. This is a very, very simplified version of what the reality seems to be. I could have added in a lot more arrows and given you a headache, but these are some of the main ones. And so the reason that I have all those mysterious Neanderthal genes is because of that big blue arrow. The reason that East Asians have, and Southeast Asians have more Neanderthal DNA than, say, Europeans seems to be because they interbred with Neanderthals more. There were more interbreeding events. And so when we try to put this all into a big picture, what we see is humans originating in Africa, maybe interbreeding with other kinds of humans in Africa. That's a big question that remains to be sorted out. And then expanding out of Africa, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe coming the south end of the Red Sea, maybe going through Sinai, and then encountering Neanderthals, Denisovans, others. There's interbreeding. There's also extinction. So there's no distinct group of people that we would call Neanderthals around anymore. There are no more hobbits. There's just us. And so that's another interesting question of how it was that this big expansion happened, and then all of that diversity I was showing you started to go away. But it's still it is still with us, and it for those of you who, for example, study the brain, it probably has a big impact, not just on the human brain per se, but on differences between humans, because we inherit different Neanderthal genes. And I wrote an article based on a paper that came out in Current Biology recently, where if you inherit certain Neanderthal genes, there are 2 of them that have been identified so far, your brain has a slightly Neanderthal shape. You can see here, Neanderthals had sort of football-like brains, and sort of modern human brains are rounder. And it appears that the reason that having these Neanderthal genes changes your shape a little has to do with the way that particular regions of the brain are different. And the cerebellum, the putamen, these are regions that have specialized functions. So what does that mean? I mean, the thing is that you can find people who have these Neanderthal genes or don't within a population. The study was actually done in the Netherlands. So it's not like you can say oh, all the Europeans over here have brains like this, and all the Asians have brains like that. It's way more complicated than that, but we don't really know what it all means. Finally, just one last example. And this is like the most, I'd say the most charged one, because is about skin color. Skin color was one of the sort of primordial ways in which people would distinguish groups of people from each other. I mean, it was one of the foundations for the concept of race, for racism. So black people were, the argument was their skin was dark because of the curse of Ham, because it was an outward sign of their inferiority, and therefore it was okay to enslave them. There was plenty of writing during the Enlightenment making this kind of argument. But what is skin color, and why is it that people have different colors? So Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania has been looking into this with some colleagues. And what's interesting is that we have a very simplistic idea about skin color, but the reality of skin color is pretty complicated. That you have people with dark skin in lots of different places, including the Bolivian highlands. And even within Africa, people will call Africans, quote unquote, black, but there's a huge range of skin color just within Africa. So these folks are all, not just within Africa, they all live pretty close to each other in East Africa. I should say the bottom three, sorry. The Botswana people are in South Africa. But part of this is because Africa covers a huge range in terms of from the equator outwards. And so you're being exposed to different levels of sunlight. And so Tishkoff and her colleagues took a look at looked for genes that they could associate with differences in skin color among Africans, and found they found a bunch of new genes that hadn't been identified before. And they were actually able to estimate when the mutations that caused differences in skin color arose. And you can see they found a combination of gene variants that lead to light skin and dark skin within Africa, and that several of them, as you can see here, actually they arose before our species existed. So the history of skin biology is really complicated. What seemed to be the simplest thing about human differences is actually remarkably complicated and has a deep history that we don't really understand. We don't know actually exactly what the color of the first Homo sapiens was. Maybe there were very light-skinned Africans at the time and very dark-skinned ones, or maybe there was a combination of these genes. It's hard to know. What's also exciting about skin color is that when scientists get DNA out of ancient skeletons, one of the many things that they can do is they can try to infer what their skin color might be. This is still a very rough art at this point because there may be genes that influence skin color that we don't yet understand. Nevertheless, at the Natural History Museum in London, not too long ago, they actually put up this bust of what's called Cheddar Man, which is a very famous skeleton in Britain. They recently published the results on this. They were able to get DNA out of Cheddar Man, and as far as they can tell, it seems that its skin was certainly not pale, and it might have been either dark or very dark. As you can imagine, this made quite a stir, and there were just a lot of people who did not want to believe that the people who lived on their island once looked like that. It was kind of an ugly scene, but that's where the science goes. And the reason that people in England don't look like Cheddar Man now has more to do with human history and human movement than about evolution per se. And DNA is actually showing us that even in just the past, say, 10,000 years, there's been these incredible movements of people and mixing their genes together. So in Africa, you can't look at anybody in Africa today as being some sort of like timeless, primitive representative of the origin of our species. That is kind of a racist way of looking at it, and the DNA shows that even these what are once called the Bushmen of the Kalahari, people like the San, they have DNA coming in from out of Africa several thousand years ago. So even in Africa, there's been all this mixing, and this is to understand what is happening in Europe, I've cribbed some pictures from David Reich's book. You have people coming out of Africa and then expanding into other places. And so by 40,000 years ago, you've got people in Central Europe. You've got these hunter-gatherers. But these people are not closely related to living Europeans. You have other expansions. So you have, say, around 30,000 years ago, you have an expansion coming from another part of Europe. And then during the ice, as the glaciers are retreating in the Ice Age, you have an expansion coming, seems to be out of Spain. And as these people move into areas, they are either interbreeding or replacing the people who are there. These are all hunter-gatherers, but there's a huge, complicated history. Even 14,000 years ago, you have yet another expansion. Things really get dramatic when farming is invented, and then you have people from Anatolia spreading through Europe, coming into contact with hunter-gatherers, sometimes pushing them out of the way, sometimes just stopping where they can't really farm successfully. But they do manage to get to England and Spain, among other places. But then you have yet another expansion, something that was really exciting to report on just a few years ago. You have people from the Russian steppes showing up, what are relatives of what people call the Yamnaya. And they just come in and really make their mark. In some places, they completely take over. In other places, they interbreed. And it's those Yamnaya pastoralists, and it's also the farmers coming from Anatolia who seem to have lighter skin. And as they move in and as their genes become more common, the skin of Europeans in different places gets lighter. So it's a replacement. It's not just, oh, you're European, therefore you're white. David Reich and his colleagues have also done more recently some really remarkable work focused in Spain, a relatively limited place. But there's so much ancient DNA now that you can get this very fine-grained look. And so this kind of, very complicated diagram, the one reason I'm showing it to you is just to make the point, it's complicated. In one little place like Spain, it's complicated. You start 9,000 years ago, with these hunter-gatherers I was telling you about. Farmers arrive, the people from the steppe arrive, but then you get more people coming in. All through history, the genetic profile of the people in Spain is changing, so that the people today over here are not the people there. Because of this constant mixing and turbulence of history, you can't just look at it as some sort of like simple kind of march of progress. So, just to sum up, I mean, I think that, what's been my challenge in reporting on human evolution and human history has been that how do you get that complexity into relatively short articles? But the message is clear. Whether you're looking on the scale of millions of years ago, whether you're looking at the scale of the past couple 100,000 years, or even just the past few thousand years, we gotta get beyond this way of talking about human history. We have to take that chain and we have to break it and replace it with something more interesting. And that's been my privilege to do as a journalist, and I'm sure that I'll be doing a lot more of it in years to come. So. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. There are mics in the center of the aisles. If you have some questions to ask, please make your way to that mic.
Hi, that was fascinating. What's the current thinking of the role that the emergence of language played on sorting all this out?
Yeah, so the question is, what about the emergence of language and sorting all this out? So language has been like one of the great towering challenges in understanding human evolution. There's supposedly, at the Académie Française in the 19th century, they just said, stop it, we're not going to talk about it because it's just too complicated and pointless to discuss. It seemed, I would say, maybe about, how long ago now? About 15 years ago, it seemed like we were on our way to figuring that out. There was a gene called FOXP2, which had, if people had mutations to it, it seemed like it affected their ability to use grammar, to speak. And people said, this is a language gene. And then they compared it to other species, and they found that there were some interesting molecular changes to it that seemed to be possessed by every human. And so the thing was like, aha, like natural selection in the past, say, 100,000 years changed this gene. It helped us to give language. Boom, we were able to do things totally differently than Neanderthals and others, and that's why we won. I've been exaggerating a little bit, but there was that kind of an attitude. There was a lot of excitement about FOXP2. There was actually a paper that came out a few months ago where scientists said, we only seem to have been looking at FOXP2 at a pretty limited number of people. What if we'd be more systematic about this? What if we'd be global about this? And lo and behold, it turns out that people have lots of versions of FOXP2 that you would have thought would make them unable to speak because they have different mutations in it. And so I would argue that, I literally had the FOXP2 story in a textbook I co-authored. In the new edition, I took it out because I don't think we understand that story well at all now. That's my sense of it. There may be some FOXP2 researchers here who are going to lecture me. Please do. But it's gotten a lot messier. And you can argue that, yes, language, our ability to communicate, that must have helped, sure. But we don't really, maybe Neanderthals and Denisovans were able to communicate pretty well, too. I don't think we know. And so, I would love for there to be some great advances in language evolution to report on as a reporter. But I'm not really seeing it right now. In fact, things that we thought were clear have gotten unclear the closer we've looked. It's science, it happens.
Well, Carl, great talk. Thanks very much. I'm wondering whether in all this genetic analysis, there's evidence for post-zygotic isolation in some sense or incompatibility. In other words, you have all these populations moving amongst each other. Mm-hmm. And they obviously mate with each other and produce offspring. But are there movements where they don't mate and produce offspring? In other words, and that could be because they don't want to mate, this sort of pre-zygotic isolation. They just don't want to mate with each other, and we've seen a lot of that. But it could also be due to some incompatibility between these separate, rather different species. And there's two questions here. One is, would you expect there to be this kind of isolation? And it seems like humans can mate with anyone currently on the planet. But is there any evidence for it in all these populations?
So we have this paradoxical situation where you have populations that that become isolated from each other, but then mix with each other from time to time. And so we're sort of stuck in this kind of in-between situation. I don't, were humans and Neanderthals not just attracted to each other? Well, I guess we get into issues about what attraction is. It's a little harder for humans than for fruit flies to talk about that. It's more complex. I mean, clearly, like humans and Neanderthals, when they made contact, did not just sort of merge, flow together, and in just sort of into one union. But it's not like they were completely apart. In fact, there seem to be repeated contacts. And but what is interesting is that why is it that we have relatively little Neanderthal DNA? There have been models that suggest that there was a sort of inheriting Neanderthal genes did lower fitness overall for modern humans. Mm-hmm. There might have been some Neanderthal genes that would give you some advantages, like maybe immunity to diseases in Asia, maybe. That's one idea that people have offered. But for the most part, it seems like they lowered fitness, and so that they've been gradually going away. Although there's a lot of research on that, and I may be forgetting a recent study or something. That's a possibility.
There clearly is evidence in biology for reasonably closely related species which would be able to physically mate, but which, of course, are not viable. And that's a post-zygotic problem.
Clearly, those hybrids were viable.
No, of course, those were viable. So the question is, do you see examples of close mixing with no mixing? Physical mixing, but no mixing genetically, and you see, and can that be attributed to some, biological incompatibility in development or something? It's kind of, I just don't have a feel for why all this happens so readily, except that it does,
Yeah.
So.
It's a huge open question. It's just a huge open question, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl.
Thanks. Thank you very much.